Lando Norris and Max Verstappen seem to be building towards a crescendo at the end of the Austrian Grand Prix, and unfortunately that crescendo turned out to be a collision that cost them both a shot at victory. Edd Straw's here to discuss it with me. Ed, let's very quickly look at the incident and the penalty that was given by the stewards. Verstappen was deemed to be at fault, picked up a 10-second penalty. What's your read on that?
Yeah, he was absolutely banged to rights on that. Norris was on the brakes. Verstappen had moved to the inside or to the middle to defend. So Norris went into a space, pulled alongside. Verstappen moved over to the left. Nowhere for Norris to go. Absolutely slam dunk, causing a collision penalty. And that's what the stewards agreed as well.
Yeah, it's a tiny misjudgment from Verstappen. It's not like a huge swerve or anything like that. But the way F1's rules are written, as you say, bang to rights. More interesting for me is the fallout from this. And that begins really with what they both said after the race. Scott Mitchell-Malm, who you see regularly on this channel, is in Austria for us. He spoke to them both firsthand. So he's had their firsthand accounts post-race. So let's quickly hear from the paddock what Scott made of what they said.
It was probably inevitable that Lando Norris and Max Verstappen were going to come together at some point, given how much they've been racing each other in recent Grand Prix. And it was also probably inevitable that they would disagree over who was to blame when they did eventually come together. And that's exactly what has happened here. Norris feels that Verstappen went too far, moved in the braking zone and wasn't fair. Verstappen feels that Norris was too unpredictable and dive-bombing him too much. But what's interesting is very different answers to what this means for their relationship and how they address this. Verstappen basically shrugged it off, said it's not the time to talk about this now, but they'll basically clear the air between them and then things will carry on pretty much as normal. Norris, a little bit different, suggesting it is nothing to do with him and it's not his responsibility to address this and clear the air, because he clearly feels Verstappen's the one to blame. And Verstappen was Norris was a lot more aggrieved than Verstappen was about how the other driver drove. Verstappen was putting a bit of blame on Norris, but Norris was the one who was accusing Verstappen of not racing fairly and respectfully. So this is the kind of thing where it's not going to completely destroy their relationship or anything like that, but now that they've raced each other like this, now that they've collided like this, it will inevitably add a little bit of steel when they come together on track in the future.
Good stuff from Scott there. Good to hear from him. Ed, what did you make of that contrast that Scott outlined there between the way Norris and Verstappen reacted a few minutes afterwards?
Yeah, it was interesting, wasn't it? Because over the radio, Verstappen had been fairly strong, but he did seem to have eased off on the incident, let's say. Presumably he had seen a replay as well. And so he was trying to turn it around a bit and talk about the fact the team had put him in that position, which was a legitimate point. Strategic errors, running the first stint a bit too long. Pit stops weren't good, particularly the final one. So that was a fair point from him. But I think he didn't really want this to be a battle about that specific incident, because I think he probably knew that the penalty was legitimate. I'm sure he'd have been much more forceful had it not been. Norris, by contrast, was very, very forceful. He knew that on the collision, he was not at fault and Verstappen was. And so he was able to take the high ground and say, well, let's see how he responds and what his thoughts are about it. It's not down to me to go and start a conversation. It's down to Max.
Yeah, really punchy stuff from Norris. And I have to say, even more punchy stuff from his team boss, Andrea Stella, who went into referencing 2021 and Verstappen's battles with Lewis Hamilton. And he said that these things were not addressed properly back then, and that's what's caused this. He said Max doesn't need to race this way. I was quite taken aback by this. I just didn't see it coming. What did you make of it?
Well, the thing with Andrea Stella is he's got a great way with words and he has very strong opinions on them, and he articulates them extremely strongly.
He didn't say it by accident, did he?
Exactly. It was actually quite funny as well, because he opened up his answer by saying, well, everyone in the world could see what happened there except for one group of people. So that was clearly pointing at Red Bull and saying, well, Red Bull and Verstappen don't need to do this. It's bad for their reputation, etc., etc. And I think he was bang on the money in terms of how past incidents have been dealt with. I don't just think it's about Verstappen as well. It's about Formula One in the wider sense. I think that the rules of engagement, if you want, in terms of wheel-to-wheel racing have really just drifted so far. No one really knows where they stand anymore. And I think that's because they've desperately tried to layer in these rules about what you can and cannot do. And it's just lost that basic thing that all the drivers involved need to accept they all need to get round a track they're all sharing bits of. So I think there's a wider mess. Yes, some of the 21 Verstappen stuff is part of that. And I can't actually blame drivers for if they've got away with stuff before, or if there's inconsistencies that they feel are there, that they will be a little bit forceful. So good point from Andrea Stella.
Yeah, I have to say, when F1 is determined to create black and white rules for dynamic situations, cars in different positions, different profiles of corner. I think even Max said that corner kind of invites these sort of things to happen. He's had something very similar there in the past with Charles Leclerc. So it's as Stella says, we're asking for trouble here. I don't necessarily think that it has to mean that what was decided in 2021 was wrong, if we could get that consistency that you mentioned there. But the fact is, the things that happened in 2021 have set a precedent, and that's now why people race the way that they do. But talking about how drivers race with each other, this was, as I said at the start, a crescendo. We built to a crescendo. This was a long-running battle. There'd been a few laps of Norris attacking Max, and both drivers were getting upset with each other even before they collided. Lando didn't like Max as he felt moving in the braking zone or moving too late to defend. Max didn't like Lando making these huge lunges up the inside, at times taking them both off the track. How did you read the rest of the battle before they collided?
Yeah, there was plenty going on, and I think we also have to remember the context of the sprint race, where Norris had absolutely nailed Verstappen under braking into turn 3, then threw it away by not covering the inside, that amateur error he referred to. So Verstappen will have had that in mind, and that was the way Norris tried to go initially, and he was getting frustrated with Verstappen moving in the braking area. Verstappen says, no, I wasn't. I know when I brake and I moved before. I'm not sure about that. I think certainly the first one, lap 55, I think, if he wasn't already on the brakes there in some way, I don't think he'd have made the corner. So, yeah, I'm not entirely convinced by that. So I think Norris has a point there. But Norris was obviously getting more and more attacking. There was a few laps after that where he sort of locked up, ultimately did just dive bomb him and went off the track himself. So I think Verstappen's got a point there. But then, of course, the way this built up is what caused the final incident, because Norris thought, well, there's no way I can go up the inside. I've tried everything. He's going to move. I've got to go to the outside. And that's what then created the situation. Verstappen had kind of staked a claim to what he was going to do. And that's why Norris went that way. And then he went the other way and moved over to the left into the corner. So this very much built up. I don't think that Norris was absolutely perfect in all areas. It's just in the incident that did actually cause the penalty that was the most extreme one with the contact, that was 100% Verstappen. But a very, very interesting build-up, I agree. And in the wider context of Norris versus Verstappen, this developing multi-race battle, very, very interesting.
That's the thing, isn't it? They're such good friends off the track. And up to now, that relationship hasn't really been tested. We've even had little moments like Lando putting Max on the grass at the start in Spain, but because Max won the race, they had a little joke about it in the cool down room. So we haven't really tested their friendship. But are we reaching that point now? Is this a line in the sand moment where it's like, okay, they both overstepped, they both know they won't go there again, or is this just the beginning of this potentially spiraling and many more collisions to come? And if so, can their friendship survive that? Is that even possible?
Yeah, it's extremely difficult because if you do cross paths, cross swords on track regularly, it does get stressed. And sometimes you see drivers like this, they fall out a bit when they're racing at the front in F1, and then once it's all done, they become friendly again. So that could be the trajectory. I suspect it will build into that because McLaren is so consistently strong. The one thing I do have in mind, though, is I thought that might happen with Verstappen and Charles Leclerc after the collision they had at the same corner, turn 3 in Austria in 2019. But the Ferrari hasn't been consistently quick enough. But I think the McLaren, it's a good, solid all-round car. Max Verstappen said they're always there. And basically, there is a papaya car bothering Max Verstappen with great regularity at the moment. So, yeah, I think this one will build up. And the first question for Verstappen and Norris is how they handle it. Will there be a bit of a cooling or can they shrug it off? But if it keeps happening, they won't be able to shrug it off.
Yeah, I can't see how they can shrug it off because we've seen it. As you mentioned Leclerc there. We obviously talked about Hamilton previously. Verstappen is incredibly tough in battle. He would argue that he goes up to the limit and doesn't overstep. But even if he's on the limit, that requires anyone he's racing to be on the limit as well. And you only need to go over by a small margin, really like Max did today. It's a tiny, tiny misjudgment that caused the collision. But Lando's got a choice to make. He either comes off second best every time when he races against Max because Max is willing to be tougher than him, or he has to be as tough as Max. And I think that means they are going to keep having these battles. Like McLaren's form doesn't feel like a flash in the pan now. So there's going to be more and more of this to come. And they may not be teammates like Lewis Hamilton and Nico Rosberg were. But remember, those two were really good friends. And in the end, their friendship couldn't sustain the battles that they had. Obviously, added tension there when you're in the same garage. But that's a neat way, actually. Let's move on to Mercedes, because Ed, a Mercedes won this race. And I think, as George Russell said afterwards, who would have thought that at the start of the year in Bahrain? Plenty of luck involved, obviously. He wasn't right on their tail, but you have to be best of the rest. You have to put yourself in that position to be the person who can then benefit when something like this happens.
Yeah, and George Russell did that extremely well all weekend. I think this was his strongest all-round performance of the year. That's partly helped by the fact that Mercedes is now a little bit more consistent, a bit more predictable. It doesn't swing in all sorts of different balanced directions as the conditions vary, so it makes it easier to do that. But he was quicker than Hamilton. He was quick throughout the sprint component of the weekend as well, qualifying the Grand Prix also. And this was a really, really strong third-place performance from Russell that meant he was there to pick up the pieces. So the first place is a bonus, but it's great to see Russell putting together that kind of complete weekend. There wasn't an obvious weak point, and he was rewarded. And he hasn't always done that this year. And you saw in Canada, he got a bit overexcited when he was running at the front in the car that in dry conditions was the fastest. But really, really good for Russell. Great boost for Mercedes. They really have made progress with this car. Still more to come. But yeah, they couldn't have picked up this win a few months ago. They'd have been too far back. Someone else would have inherited it then. Really good job from Mercedes.
Well, you mentioned someone else could have picked up the win on a different weekend where perhaps qualifying plays out slightly differently. Is Oscar Piastri that person?
Absolutely, yes. He started 7th, having been given the penalty of losing his final lap time after he ran wide, busted track limits by a few millimetres. He wasn't particularly happy about that. McLaren tried to push back, but their protest wasn't admissible. If he'd started in position up there with Norris, then 100% he'd have been there to pick up the pieces. Although, of course, he could also have got involved in the battle as well, so it would have changed the race. But Piastri, a podium for him. He hasn't had many Formula One podiums, but he will be kicking himself. And watching him in that podium antechamber, sat in the second place chair, I think he was thinking, yeah, this was one I should have been there to pick up the pieces. But millimetres make a difference, don't they? And he'll be ruining that very, very slight wide moment for a long time.